DEQ's work related to Comores and GenX here in North Carolina. So we're going to get started in just a minute. First of all, I wanted to give you some information about tonight and about the format we're using tonight. First, my name's Julie Woosley. I'm the Deputy Director in the Division of Waste Management, and I'll act as your moderator tonight. We're on a WebEx platform as a WebEx event, and what that means is that all the mics are automatically muted to reduce background noise. So that means when we get to the Q&A session, what we'll do is call the folks who have signed up to speak, and we'll unmute your mic to give you your 2 minutes to share your question. If you called in on a phone number instead of joining through the WebEx app, that's a little more difficult, but here's how we'll do it. If you have signed up to speak, but you're not joining us through the WebEx app, what you'll need to do is raise your hand so that we can recognize your phone number when you're called to speak. And the way you raise your hand on a phone line is you dial *3. So make a note of that, *3, when we call your name if you're not on the WebEx app. Later on, there'll be a question and answer box that will pop up in the WebEx application. You'll be able to see it on the bottom right, and you'll be able to enter questions there. So after we've allowed the folks who've signed up to speak to ask their questions, if we have additional time, we'll take questions that way. If we don't have time to get to your question tonight, please go ahead and enter it in the Q&A box. We'll take that question. We also have ways for you to send us questions at other times, and that includes our email, which is comments.comores@ncdenr.gov. And you can also, of course, call us. You'll see contact information for each speaker at the end of their presentation. All the presentations you see tonight will be available on the website probably later this week, but in the short future. So let me first give you a quick agenda overview. First, we're going to hear remarks from DEQ Secretary Elizabeth Pfias. Then we'll hear from the Assistant Secretary for the Environment, Sushma Massamore. Then we'll hear from the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, Public Health Section, just as we have at other events. And then we'll hear from the divisions in DEQ, starting with Waste Management, then Water Resources, then Air Quality. After all the speaker presentations have completed, that's when we'll move on to the question and answer portion of the evening. All the speakers will be on a virtual panel to answer those questions. As I mentioned before, if you've signed up to speak, we'll call your name. You will have 2 minutes to state your question. And we do ask that you be respectful of the other folks who would like to ask questions tonight. Keep your comments to those 2 minutes so that everyone has time to ask questions. If we have time at the end, as I mentioned before, we'll go back to any folks who have signed up for more than one time slot, and then we'll look at additional questions that come in if there's time available. Please try not to go past your allotted time, again, just so everyone has time to speak, but we're asking you to keep your comments and your question to 2 minutes. So I think that is all the information you need to know about our event today and how to interact with us. If you look now at the bottom right, you should see the question and answer panel, and that's where you can go ahead and enter questions at any time. You don't have to wait to the end. You can enter your questions as we go through. So let me start by introducing our secretary. Elizabeth Pfias was nominated Secretary of the Department of Environmental Quality in June of 2021 and confirmed in August. She formerly worked with DEQ as the Director of Legislative Affairs, and we're pleased to have her back with us. So let me hand it over to you, Secretary Pfias.
Well, thank you, Julie, and good evening. Thank you all for taking the time out of your evening to join us. We appreciate the opportunity to update you on the state's actions related to GenX and the Comores facility. Let me start by saying that Pfas is and will remain a priority issue at DEQ under my tenure. I have been challenging the team to step back and assess where we are, where we have been, and where we are going. As you all know, because of GenX and Comores, North Carolina has been involved in this issue for more than 4 years. In the absence of federal standards, in 2017, DEQ took decisive action to stop Chemours from releasing GenX into the air and water, dealing first with a source of the ongoing contamination. The next step was to provide replacement drinking water supplies to affected residents through the consent order between DEQ, Cape Fear River Watch, and Chemours. The consent order also laid out specific actions to permanently reduce the emissions and discharges by at least 99% and reduce the PFAS contributions to the Cape Fear River from the contaminated site. It also requires a number of assessments and studies to better define the extent of the contamination, advance the science around these specific compounds, and address actions for the cleanup of residual contamination. This evening, directors from our divisions of waste management, water resources, and air quality will update you on the implementation of those measures. Since 2017, North Carolinians have also been calling for federal action on the issue of PFAS contamination. And just last month, former DEQ Secretary and current EPA Administrator Michael Regan announced his agency's PFAS roadmap right here in North Carolina. We believe the actions in the EPA roadmap reinforce and complement the steps North Carolina has taken to combat PFAS pollution, address contamination, and protect your communities. This EPA roadmap means more data, more standards, and more support for the kinds of actions that North Carolina has been taken to protect our residents and our drinking water. Assistant Secretary Sushma Mays-Moore will talk more about what that roadmap means for North Carolina in just a few minutes. The EPA also released its final toxicity assessment for GenX, which will be followed in a matter of months by a federal drinking water health advisory. On November 3rd, DEQ announced additional actions. First, since we expect EPA to release a health advisory level for GenX that will be lower than 140 parts per trillion, we are requiring Chemours to do several things. First, we're requiring them to review existing well sampling data to identify the residents with GenX detections in their well samples who will be entitled to public water or whole house building filtration under a lower health advisory level. We're also requiring them to revise the assessment of public water feasibility for all affected residents. And lastly, we're requiring them to develop a plan for transitioning affected residents who have previously received reverse osmosis systems to public water or whole house filtration systems if they are above the announced health advisory level for GenX. Second, DEQ's investigation has revealed contamination from Chemours has reached private drinking water wells in New Hanover County. So we are also requiring Chemours to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the groundwater contamination in private wells in communities downstream. And that includes New Hanover, Pender, Columbus, and Brunswick counties. Chemours must also provide a plan for sampling drinking water wells to identify residents who are entitled to receive replacement water supplies. DEQ has been working on this issue for more than 4 years now, but I understand that you have been living with this day in and day out. And I want you to know that we hear your concerns and we will continue to use the state's authority and the upcoming federal actions to address this contamination and to continue to hold Chemours accountable. So with that, Sushma, I believe I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Secretary Beiser. Good evening. My name is Sushma Mays-Moore. I'm the Assistant Secretary for Environment. I have the oversight of all the DEQ regulatory divisions. As Secretary Beiser mentioned, EPA has introduced a PFAS roadmap. It's a whole of agency approach, along with other federal agencies, to take actions at the federal level over the next few years. Some of the actions related to the roadmap fall into 3 categories. The first is research. EPA is developing an approach to better understand PFAS and their effects. The second is to restrict. These are actions to prevent PFAS from entering air, land, and water at levels that can impact the human health and the environment. And remediate. These are the ways to broaden or accelerate the cleanup of PFAS and contamination. I won't go through all of the specific actions that EPA plans to take, but there are a few particular importance that are of value to North Carolina. First was the release of the final GenX toxicity announcement, and the upcoming federal drinking water health advisory related to GenX is expected in the coming months. EPA is also developing a national PFAS testing strategy to deepen our understanding of the impacts of categories of PFAS, including potential hazards to human health and the environment. EPA will also propose monitoring requirements at important facilities where PFAS are expected to be suspected to be present in wastewater as well as stormwater discharges. Today, you must have heard the EPA announce its plan of actions for PFOA and PFAS. These actions may sound familiar because we have taken similar actions at the Commerce facility through the consent order. The roadmap also includes a number of actions to advance the science around PFAS compounds. And this includes advancing our understanding of the health impacts as well as developing lab methods. That information will help strengthen actions at both the federal level as well as here in the state, allowing us to make informed decisions and develop our next steps. At the state level, we are finalizing an emerging compounds framework that follows a similar strategy of assessing the available science and identifying any data gaps. We're also working to utilize the expertise of our Science Advisory Board, our SAB, as well as our colleagues at DHHS. And we hope to determine the most effective regulatory actions within our authority that may mean a variety of things from permit conditions to standard setting, as well as rulemaking. Our goal is to act comprehensively and consistently to protect the residents of North Carolina, as well as resources in our community. We don't plan to wait for EPA actions, but we will coordinate to make sure our actions are aligned, consistent, and that we build on EPA's path forward. Under the actions we announced earlier this month that you just heard Secretary Beiser mentioned, Comores is required to assess contamination of private wells in the downstream communities, counties, and also review the existing sampling data that are in collection in light of the expanded and expected EPA GenX health advisory. Comores is also required to provide updated plans to DEQ by February 1 of next year. And as those plans are in our hands and we review and approve them, we will provide updates to you all, and that will be our next steps. And that is my summary. Julie, thank you.
Julie, you may be on mute.
Thank you, Michael. It is time to move on to the speakers. So let me first introduce Department of Health and Human Services. And Zach Moore is the Epidemiology Section Chief in the Division of Public Health in DHHS, and he's going to share some slides with us today. Go ahead, Zach.
Great. Thank you, Julie and Secretary Beiser and Assistant Secretary Mazemore, and thanks to everybody for being here this evening. I'm going to start off with some information updates on GenX and on PFAS, a little bit of background on what we know about health effects and the new United States EPA Toxicity Assessment, and I will try to be brief, recognizing there's a lot to get through. Next slide, please. So I do want to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what PFAS are. So it stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And this is a large group of chemicals that are man-made, so they don't occur in the environment. They're not natural. They include PFOA, GenX, many others that people might be familiar with. It's estimated there are probably more than 5,000 different PFAS, different chemicals in this class. These have been in use since the 1950s for a variety of reasons, most of which relate to their properties for resisting stains and grease and water, and also used in firefighting foams. And because of their widespread use, they're also very common in the environment, and unfortunately can also be found in the blood of people when testing is done really across the country. Next slide, please. So how do people get exposed to PFAS? Well, it can happen in a number of ways. One that's of particular concern is through contaminated drinking water, which is something we'll be talking about this evening. It can also be exposed through PFAS in foods, particularly, or in one way through food packaging, like shown on this slide. That's often made or treated with PFAS to resist water and grease. Can be exposed through indoor dust in places where textiles, carpets, upholstery, etc., that have been treated with PFAS are present. And there can be exposure through other consumer products, some cosmetics, some other types of products, and in some workplaces where PFAS are either used or produced. Next slide, please. So we are learning a lot more, and the science is growing by the day, but there's still much more research needed to understand the health effects of PFAS on people. For one thing, I mentioned that there are many PFAS, so there's a lot of work being done to understand not just one by one, but how PFAS as a group or in specific subgroups might affect people's health. But there are things that we know so far are likely human health effects based on PFAS overall. And some of those are listed here. One is increased cholesterol levels. Another is decreased vaccine response in children, meaning that less antibodies are produced in response to vaccination, which I know is of particular concern right now with COVID and COVID vaccines. Changes in liver enzymes, increased risk of high blood pressure or a condition called preeclampsia that can affect pregnant women, small decreases in birth weight of infants, and increases in some types of cancer, including cancer of the kidneys or testes. Next slide, please. We have also heard concerns from folks in the community about PFAS and skin exposures. Again, this is an area where research is needed. What we know from the science so far is that only a small amount of PFAS can get absorbed into your body through your skin, such as through bathing, showering, or swimming. However, there are some data from laboratory studies in animals that show some PFAS can cause skin irritation at high levels. Okay, so in terms of the public health roles in trying to address contamination with GenX and other PFAS, first is to determine whether compounds, including GenX, that are detected in the environment could pose a risk to human health. And as I've just shown you, there is evidence from the scientific data and literature about several different health effects related to PFAS. And then is to provide health-based guidance on levels of exposure to such contaminants. And in the case of GenX specifically, when this issue first came up in 2016, 2017, there were no levels. We often use levels from the EPA or CDC or other existing levels, but there were no levels related to GenX. So DHHS calculated what's called a provisional drinking water health goal value that people are likely familiar with, 140 parts per trillion. And that went through an extensive review process with our Secretary of Science Advisory Board because that was an attempt to provide some guidance on levels that could be used for action. And then also we help to conduct risk assessments and risk communication. So that's taken several different forms with PFAS, including early on doing one of the first biomonitoring studies looking for levels of PFAS in the blood of a small number of people who live around the Chemours site. And that's since been taken up, and a lot more great work has been done looking at larger populations, both in that area and then down in Wilmington by colleagues at NC State University. And also focusing on risk communication. And that's included surveys of people in the community to understand what people know about PFAS, what their concerns are, how concerns about PFAS are affecting their daily lives, and how to better communicate information about PFAS, which has informed our a lot of the materials that we've developed and that have been used since this started. Next question, or next slide, please. So wanted to briefly talk about the new EPA GenX Toxicity Assessment. First of all, this is a huge development, and we're very pleased that this was released just last month, October of 2021. So this is a summary of all the potential health effects that can be associated with a chemical. And the toxicity assessment includes what's called a reference dose for GenX. And this reference dose is the starting point that can be used for creating regulatory levels, health advisory levels, other drinking water levels. The EPA GenX reference dose in the toxicity assessment is lower than the reference dose that was used in calculating the DHHS provisional drinking water health goal. It's actually based on the same animal studies, but the EPA scientists had access to other materials from those studies that they reevaluated. And then they also took into account new science that's happened since that time that led to more uncertainty about health effects of GenX, and so led to a lower reference dose in their assessment. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? Basically, based on the lower reference dose, we expect that the National Drinking Water Health Advisory for GenX will be lower than the current provisional drinking water health goal of 140 parts per trillion. And as Secretary Beiser mentioned, EPA has committed to releasing a health advisory level this coming spring, and they are working through that process now with their Science Advisory Board. Once this is released, the EPA's Drinking Water Health Advisory can be used to provide drinking water guidance. Next slide. In terms of some of the current DHHS actions, again, on communications, we are working to provide some health information to residents concerned about GenX exposure. We already have a lot up on our website that hopefully people have accessed, but we will be creating a fact sheet that will be available shortly about specifically the EPA GenX toxicity assessment and what this means, and also actions that can be taken to reduce GenX exposures. And then we'll be continuing to coordinate with our colleagues at DEQ and EPA ahead of the release of the Drinking Water Health Advisory, and you'll hear more about that from our colleagues. Next slide. Okay, so this is just information for our Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology branch. If you have any questions that aren't addressed this evening, please feel free to reach out. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Zach. Now we'll move on to our next presentation from the Division Director of the Division of Waste Management, Michael Scott. He will be speaking to you about groundwater and well testing data and give a little site history as well. Michael?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Julie. As Julie mentioned, I'm Michael Scott, the Director of the Division of Waste Management. Thank everyone for joining us this evening. Next slide, please. This evening, we'd like to touch on several specific areas in this slide deck. Talk a little more about PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, specifically one compound known as GenX that we've already touched on briefly this evening. Give a little history of this compound in North Carolina. Talk a little bit more about the November letters that Secretary Beiser referenced in her opening comments, and talk about the importance of the ongoing groundwater sampling and the consent order between Chemours, NCDEQ, and Cape Fear River Watch. Next slide, please. So when we talk about this class of compounds, meaning PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and GenX is one of PFAS, a PFAS in this family of emerging compounds. You may hear the term GenX or HFPO dimer acid or C3 dimer acid, or even see the chemical formula that's at the top of this slide. But it's a trade name for a man-made, virtually unregulated chemical that's used in manufacturing of non-stick coatings, like Dr. Moore showed us in his slide deck, and part of that family of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's produced and emitted by one company in North Carolina. That would be the Chemours Company, formerly DuPont. They're in Bladen County on the Bladen and Cumberland line along the Cape Fear River. It's been discharged or emitted to our environment for numerous years, actually several decades, as this slide shows. Until the past couple of years, the instrumentation, the ability to measure it at these low detection levels, meaning part per trillion or nanograms per liter, you'll hear us say, was not available. And with this particular family of compounds, emerging compounds, there's often no or very limited specific environmental regulations for them. Less is known about how they behave in the environment compared to other typical contaminants like petroleum or heavy metals. And as Dr. Moore said, there's little known about their effects on human health and the environment, even though we're learning more each and every day. And they do present challenges for regulatory agencies to address, and we'll talk more about that this evening. There's also a lot of information on DEQ's website regarding this family of compounds and specific contact information, not only for our department, but also the Department of Health and Human Services. Next slide, please. So a little bit of the quick history here. In mid-2017, there was a lot of focus in North Carolina on the presence of this compound, and there's a continued focus on that in surface water. But that's where the issue really started. And around the middle part of 2017, it was discovered that GenX and some other PFAS also existed in groundwater. By mid to late 2017, it was confirmed that air emission contributions, these compounds actually coming out of a stack and emitted to the air through air emissions, was a significant contributor to how these compounds ended up in the environment, which led to testing not only of stack emissions for how these compounds may be entering the environment, but also where key exposure points could exist, meaning people were drinking through private drinking water wells these compounds, and specifically the GenX compound. Around February or in February of 2019, a consent order was reached between Comores, the Department of Environmental Quality here in North Carolina, and Cape Fear River Watch. And we'll talk more about that document and the importance of it. In December of 2019, a significant step forward in the installation of the thermal oxidizer by Comores to cut off the emissions of these compounds through the stacks, if you will, to the environment. And from 2019 to 2021, there's been focus on ongoing private well testing to make sure citizens weren't exposed to these compounds, as well as different remedial efforts. And now, as you'll hear this evening, there's a lot of focus on the residual PFAS, knowing that the processed wastewater is no longer discharged to the Cape Fear River. There's not stack emissions of these compounds, but they do still exist in the environment. And that's our area of focus now. Next slide, please. This map is a good illustration in that it shows the Fayetteville Works property, the white polygons in the aerial photographs, about a 2,000 acre property on the Bladen and Cumberland line along the Cape Fear River. It includes several companies, not just Comores, but Carrari, DuPont, and others. But this illustration shows the red dots where groundwater was sampled back in 2017, and detections of PFAS, and more specifically GenX, were discovered in the on-site groundwater. This led the Department of Environmental Quality to test surrounding properties adjacent to the plant to determine if these compounds had moved off-site and were presenting an exposure risk to the surrounding community. After discovering that, in conjunction with Comores and directing them to extend further well sampling for private wells and groundwater impacts, we discovered that this impact to the community was much greater than just the surrounding homes. And I'll show you some aerial illustrations of that. As Dr. Moore mentioned, in 2017, the Department of Health and Human Services established the provisional health goal of 140 nanograms per liter or part per trillion for GenX for drinking water purposes. And we will touch on it tonight. The last bullet in this slide, as Secretary Beiser mentioned, the importance of DEQ's letter here in November, stating that not only is contamination needing to be assessed and addressed around the Comores plant in Bladen, Cumberland, Sampson, Robeson counties, but also for our lower Cape Fear citizens down in New Hanover, Brunswick, Pender, Columbus also. Next slide, please. So the consent order, if you're not familiar with this document, was the document that was entered into, as I mentioned, in February of 2019 that has specific requirements of the Chemours plant, primarily to reduce the air emissions of these compounds to the environment, to make sure any discharges of these compounds are coordinated with downstream utilities, to implement a well sampling program to ensure that people are not ingesting these compounds through private wells, and specific measures for additional penalties if conditions and deadlines are not met. Next slide, please. So in addition, the consent order also ensured that Chemours would determine what PFAS and in what amounts are being emitted in wastewater, other media, if you will, not just the stack emissions at the plant, but from other means that these compounds may leave the plant. And also to implement what's called the Drinking Water Compliance Plan to ensure there's a thorough plan to assess where these compounds may exist, where people may be consuming them through private well water, and a coordinated plan to first provide bottled water, then provide connection to municipal water or filters, which we'll show you some examples of this evening. Next slide, please. So when we talk about one of the key parts of the consent order and the sampling of private wells, which, some of our folks that may have attended tonight from the Lower Cape Fear, may not understand how the process works, but under the consent order, Chemours, through their consultant, has to sample drinking water wells a quarter mile beyond the closest well that has PFAS detections above 10 parts per trillion, and ensure that they thoroughly delineated any impacted wells, and to also annually retest wells that were previously sampled. If PFAS compounds that are listed in the consent order are found, there's a table C in the consent order, a list of compounds including GenX. If they're discovered in a private well above certain limits, which we'll talk about in just a minute, then bottled water has to be supplied within 3 days per the consent order to provide a safe drinking water supply to that homeowner. If a private well has GenX at or above the provisional health goal of 140 part per trillion, that homeowner is eligible for a permanent drinking water supply system within 9 months, which can be accomplished through a public water connection or a whole house filtration system, which we'll show you a picture of. The consent order also addresses lower levels of compounds that may not be the compound GenX. And if these compounds are detected above the 10 part per trillion, or a combined level, a summation of those compounds above 70, then households are eligible for up to 3 under the sink reverse osmosis systems per residence. And we'll show you a picture of that also. And those RO systems have to be provided within 6 months of test results being provided. So the consent order not only works to stop the emissions and introduction of these compounds to the environment, but also to address what already exists and to ensure that citizens have a safe drinking water supply. Next slide, please. So in November, as Secretary Beiser said, there were a couple of critical letters that went to Chemours. I'm just going to briefly highlight the points again. That DEQ stated that Chemours is responsible for contamination of groundwater monitoring wells and water supply wells in New Hanover County and potentially Pender, Columbus, and Brunswick counties. Chemours is expected and required per these letters to expand their off-site assessment, collection of data that was required under the consent order to determine the extent of contamination, not just around the plant, Fayetteville and Cumberland and Bladen counties, but also in the Lower Cape Fear region of North Carolina. And also to review existing well sampling data around the plant there in Bladen County to determine if households would be eligible either for whole house filtration or public water based on the actual revised toxicity assessment for GenX from the Environmental Protection Agency. And also to revise the assessment of public water feasibility for all affected residents under a lower health advisory level for GenX. And so we are requiring as DEQ a plan to transition residents who have previously received a filter system to either public water or whole house filtration systems as appropriate under a lower health advisory, as Dr. Moore and Secretary Beiser and Assistant Secretary Mazemore referenced in their comments. Next slide, please. This illustration gives you a good idea of the private well sampling around the Fayetteville Works plant where Chemours is located in Bladen County. The gray polygon is the 2,000 plus acre parcel where Chemours operates. The red parcels show you private wells or properties that have private wells that unfortunately have that GenX compound at or above the current provisional health goal of 140 part per trillion. The yellow polygons or properties that have detections of other PFAS compounds that trigger some type of filtration system, and the green polygons luckily are properties who do not have detections or less than 10 nanogram per liter detections of PFAS compounds. Next slide, please. So the summary here is important in that as we've talked about, these compounds enter the environment, a good majority of them through stack emissions. The emissions have carried up to 18 miles from the plant. So there are parts of Sampson County that are now being sampled, where private wells are being sampled, that are a great distance from the plant to the northeast. And so this summary is compiled through September of this year, where over 6,399 wells have been sampled thus far, and over 236 now that actually have GenX above that current provisional health goal of 140 part per trillion, and about 4,500 residences that have some detection of PFAS, either one compound above 10 nanograms per liter or a summation above 70 that also trigger some type of filter unit. And we have about 1,600 properties who luckily have not had detection of these compounds or very, very low levels detections that don't require filtration systems to be installed. And this data is compiled across Bladen, Cumberland, Robeson, and Sampson counties currently. Next slide, please. This map gives you a good illustration. The yellow polygon, just an outline of a yellow polygon in the direct center of the map, shows you where Chemours' current sampling is occurring. And if you look to the northeast or the upper right-hand corner of the picture, you'll see areas into Sampson County where these air emissions carried the compounds and ultimately we feel impacted groundwater. And so those wells continue to be sampled. There are 16 different sectors around that Chemours property in Bladen County where private well sampling has occurred, meaning 360 degrees around the plant. And in some of these sectors, private well sampling may be close to being complete. We've not said it was complete yet. We're still evaluating that, but more work to come. But obviously in the Northeast, well sampling continues. Next slide, please. So when it comes to sampling your well, if you've not been to some of our previous meetings or are new to the discussion from the Lower Cape Fear, most wells can be sampled without entering a residence, as this picture shows here. Chemours and DEQ are sampling wells around the Fayetteville Works property in Bladen County. Personal protective equipment is worn, social distancing guidelines are followed. And there's a critical number. The 910-678-1101 number is a number that Chemours has established for people who are requesting private well sampling. And DEQ can assist residents in the Lower Cape Fear with well sampling questions, but Chemours is currently not sampling in this area as the DEQ letters required Chemours to put together a plan to determine that approach for that region. Parsons Environment and Infrastructure is the consultant that's performing this work. It's not Chemours themselves, but a consultant. And we do encourage folks to get their wells sampled. Without that data, we don't know if you may be eligible for a filtration system or a water line connection. Next slide, please. These are just the types of filters I briefly referenced. The upper right filter is a whole house granular activated carbon system. You'll see it has two large tanks. It typically is installed in a small utility shed that Chemours provides. If a private well is at or above the 140 part per trillion health goal for GenX, this is the type of filtration system that is offered. Or connection to municipal water if that's in close proximity to the home. If the GenX compound's not detected at or above that health goal, the 140 number, then the Kinetico RO or reverse osmosis units, the lower picture in this slide, are installed in up to 3 locations, typically under the kitchen sink and 2 bathrooms in a household. And these systems, per the consent order, are maintained for up to 20 years. Next slide, please. So with municipal water, as we've talked about, if that GenX compound exists above the health goal that Dr. Moore talked about this evening, folks can be eligible for whole house filtration, the picture we just showed, or a municipal water line. It has been determined that municipal water is currently not feasible in areas east of the Cape Fear River and Bladen and Cumberland counties based on population density, proximity to water lines, and those were decisions made in conjunction with Bladen and Cumberland County. Municipal water is going to be supplied for some Bladen County residents who live west of the Cape Fear River and have GenX in their private well above that provisional health goal. And we continue to assess the feasibility of municipal water in Cumberland County areas that are west of the river. And as we've said already, the letter from DEQ in November does require Comores to revise the feasibility assessment for all affected residents in light of the expected lower EPA health advisory for GenX in 2022. Next slide, please. So if you have a specific question, once again, the 1101 number for Comores is noted here. They can also assist with bottled water questions. Comores has used a new system for people that have a different preference for a type of bottled water. They're using a new voucher system rather than delivering bottled water to your actual home. So that's a new system that some people have appreciated. Next slide, please. And in wrapping up this evening for my part of the presentation, we do send out a community update. If you'd like to be part of our newsletter, please reach out to us. The email address Julie gave, our contact information is at the end of each slide deck. We'll include you on this community mail out list to share these regular updates that we put together between DEQ and DHHS and send out via email. Thank you. Back to you, Julie.
Thank you, Michael. Next, we'll move on to Danny Smith. Danny is the Division Director for the Division of Water Resources. He's going to present to us tonight on surface water information and the ongoing work to reduce the amount of PFAS reaching the Cape Fear River from the Comores site. Danny. Danny, we can't hear you right now. Are you having some technical difficulties?
Sorry about that. Good evening, everyone. My name is Danny Smith. I'm the director with the Division of Water Resources. Thank you, Julie. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Comores facility and some of our consent order items that we've been working through at the facility. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide, I'd like to start off with a vicinity map. Some folks are more familiar with the location of the plant than others and the landscape position. In the center of the slide is the Comores facility is marked with a yellow triangle, and it's kind of bracketed in between Fayetteville and Elizabethtown, and it's adjacent to the Cape Fear River and the Cape Fear River basin. Next slide, please. So the Division of Water Resources has been working at the collecting samples at the facility since 2017. And since October 2017, Comores has been prohibited from discharging processed wastewater from their outfall known as 002. So our staff from the Fayetteville Regional Office has been sampling the Comores outfall twice per week under normal conditions. So effectively, virtually, they've been sampling continuously through this time period. So a composite sampler runs from, they put it on a Friday and it'll run continuously through Tuesday. And when they take that sample off, they set a new sampler back up, and that runs from Tuesday to Friday. So it collects a sample every 3 hours, and the volume is 350 milliliters. That's about the amount of volume of like an orange juice bottle. Next slide, please. So this picture shows the Comores campus. And if you look at the far right-hand side, you can see the Cape Fear River, and at the bottom, the locking dam. So the outfall 002, where it connects or enters into the Cape Fear River, is depicted by the orange arrow. And the composite sampler is actually, the arrow is off a little bit on this, but it is on that, I guess, triangle ellipse right above that. The orange arrow is where the sample site is located, is the composite sampler, and that insert picture in the bottom left is the sampler. And what occurs is there's a tube that goes down into the effluent channel, and it pulls those aliquots sample up into a container at the bottom of that composite sampler, and that's what's replaced every 3.5 days or so. So next slide, please. So this is a graph starting in November 2017 through July 2021. The graph depicts well where we started, really. The 002 outfall had nearly 40,000 nanograms per liter, or parts per trillion, of GenX coming through the outfall. And this slide depicts GenX and PFO and Pfas. One of the things I want to point out is on the bottom axis, one, you can't see the data very well because of the scale. So the next slide, we're going to take an excerpt out of that. It's the same data set, but you'll be able to see it closer. But I do want to point out on the far right-hand portion of this slide is we're going to look at this data a little bit too on the next slide. So next slide, please. So again, this is the same data. It's just pulled out so we can see it closer at a smaller scale. The red lines is GenX, and there's also PFO and Pfas is very much so at the bottom. And the far right-hand side is 2021. It goes through the first quarter, January, February, March, and then April, May, and it stops in July and August. So there are some elevated spikes in that location. One, I want to point them out. Department and the Division of Water Resources were continuing to investigate the cause of those elevated spikes. So thank you. Let's see, next slide, please. So I was just talking about the outfall 002 and that sampling effort and that continual oversight of what's going out of that outfall location. But I also want to talk about the consent order. It was signed in February 2019, and some of the items in the consent order include the requirement for Comores to install a treatment system at MPDS permitted outfall at 003. I want to talk about that in just a second. To address the stormwater from the monomers ion exchange materials area flow through seeps A, B, C, and D, and the addition of a barrier wall and a groundwater extraction system. So we're going to talk about all four of those different types of consent order items going forward. So next slide, please. So the old outfall channel is known as Outfall 002. And this was previously used to discharge the processed wastewater from Comores, and this is some time ago, prior to October 2012. So this feature no longer receives this processed wastewater, but it is contaminated. So the surface water and stormwater and groundwater coursing through the feature has got high concentrations of PFAS. So as a part of the consent order, it was a requirement for Comores to implement and construct a treatment system to capture the dry weather flow, base flow of approximately 610 gallons per minute. And the expectation was that this would be accomplished by September 30th, 2020. So again, the requirement is for Comores to treat the base flow in the channel and to remove at least 99% of the GenX and PFMOAA and PMPA. So obviously the purpose is to remove the PFAS and reduce the loading into the Cape Fear River. Next slide, please. So this is, so again, this is the Comores campus, and then you can get context for the lock and dam location. The blue box is approximately where the treatment facility is located. It is, again, granular activated carbon, and this is where the base flow, or 610 gallons per minute, is pulled out of that channel. You can see that sinuous kind of dark green line. That's the location of the old 002 outfall and what we call now 003. Next slide, please. So the as required by the consent order, Comores designed and constructed and installed this system by September 30th, 2020, and the system was operational by then. The Division of Water Resources, as a part of this effort, conducted inspections, and with that, this outfall is associated with or permitted by an NPDES, a National Pollution Discharge Elimination Systems permit. So it's the Comores' permittee is required to submit discharge monthly monitoring reports. So between the inspections and reviewing those monthly monitoring reports, the Division of Water Resources confirmed permit limit exceedances in October and November of 2020. So in response, what we did is we issued a notice of violation and assessed the civil penalty for the violations as well. But since December 2020, the remediation systems have remained in compliance, and the effluent limits are treating flow to greater than 99% removal. Next slide, please. So I was just talking about the 003 and the requirement for the installation of that treatment system. This is a different item. This is a stormwater capture treatment system, a different requirement. And the focus is on the monomer ion exchange materials area. So the insert photo on the left with the red box is that's the Comores campus, and that's the area of focus as far as the stormwater control system. And the picture on the right shows the capture system, the green lines, if you will, and also the drainage area is that blue shaded area that is being addressed. So so Comores has constructed and installed a system to capture stormwater runoff from this area, and that's for precipitation events up to 1 inch in 24-hour design storm. The sample results indicate that the treatment system removed all three of those Pfas indicators to greater than 99% during the months of July and August this past summer. We have 2 months. We recently got that account in September. So the data is new, but the system seems to be working well. Next slide, please. So shifting to a different consent order item, and this again is a whole separate area or effort to intercept and remove PFAS, separate from the other two we just went through. These are flow-through cells or to address seeps, and there's 4 of them, seeps A through D. So per the consent order, Comores is installing in situ or in place treatment systems to remove PFAS from these seeps. So the treatment system consists of a cell that they construct that's designed for the water to flow through it, and the cell contains granular activated carbon. And so again, there are four discrete seeps that have been identified, and PFAS from the site reaches the Cape Fear River from these seeps. So the 4 treatment systems were installed during late 2020 and through the spring. And actually, the last work was in early June. Next slide, please. So this is we're standing on the flow-through cell at seep A, and we're at the inflow of it and looking downslope. So there's 2 cells, and the water courses in and flows through the granular activated carbon. The removal efficiency of the capture base flow seeps A through D range from 99.5% to greater than 99.9%. So Comores is continuing to evaluate and modify the operational and maintenance efforts with these systems. In this photo, you can see, again, the composite samplers and flow meters both had the intake and towards the F1 as well. The blanket at the back is efforts to remove or prevent algae from going on it to help with the function of the carbon filters. All right, next slide, please. So we just talked about seeps A through D, and in addition to that, Comores is proposing to install a barrier wall and groundwater extraction system. Again, this is part of the consent order, and this is to have a more permanent remedy to those flow-through cells. They're more of an interim measure. So on August 13th, DEQ received the submission of a barrier wall and groundwater extraction system. This was a 60% design report of this proposal. We reviewed the report and conditionally approved it. We have some questions, and we will see the 90% version of this going forward. But what's proposed is the system includes a barrier wall and extraction wells and groundwater capture system. So the purpose is to control groundwater in both the superficial and Black Creek aquifers, and seeps that form from the discharges of water at the bluff face. And that discharge at the bluff face is seeps A, B, C, and D. So the capture treatment system is, again, designed to remove at least 99% of the PFAS flowing from the groundwater under the facility to the Cape Fear River. It's a significant, will be a significant removal of PFAS. So the requirement by the consent order, Comores is intending to construct an approximately 6,050-foot subsurface barrier wall and groundwater extraction system that's over a mile, like 1.3 miles. The system is proposed to be completed by March 2023. Next slide. So this is a photograph or a picture of the barrier wall and groundwater extraction system. And the picture you'll see the Cape Fear River on the far right. That's the blue line. As you go upslope, there is a just before the black dots, if you will, that's where the barrier wall would be, and then the black dots are the barrier or the extraction wells. So the barrier wall design again is 6,050 feet long and 70 to 80 feet deep. So this barrier wall is not a wall you climb over or rather it's underground. It's intended to be dug into the ground where it'll mound up groundwater behind it so it can be extracted. So it'll be keyed into the upper Cape Fear confining unit. So the barrier wall is approximately a ½ meter thick. And how this is going to be constructed is there is a piece of equipment that looks like a big chainsaw or a ditch witch, if you will, that can excavate this trench at one pass 70 to 80 feet deep. So what happens is you have this one pass installation, and it mixes the soils and the bentonite and adds bentonite and cement at the same time, continuously mixing that media, creating that 1/2 meter thick wall. Next slide, please. So this is probably a better picture. Again, you can see on the far right, seeps A, B, C, and D. As you go upslope towards the plant, that green line is the barrier wall. Along that barrier wall is 64 extraction wells, and the wells are located along the entire length of the barrier wall and also extending approximately 1,000 feet north of the termination of the barrier wall, which is right in here. And that, if you look at the very north part of the slide, you see the north force main. And as that comes to an end, that's where the barrier wall stops. So there's two force mains, both to convey extracted groundwater to a treatment system. That the groundwater treatment pad is located. This is the hashed area where it's proposed to be located. So obviously for the system to work well, we'll have to have a treatment system to remove the PFAS from the extracted groundwater. The design total flow rate of that system would be 980 gallons per minute. Next slide, please. So I was going to conclude the slide presentation with some information on surface water foam. The Division of Water Resources, this is obviously not part of the consent order, but we have gotten some questions about foam. So first I want to talk a little bit about the definition of it. So surface water foam is foam floating on streams, rivers, and lakes. And it is often naturally occurring. It occurs when you have turbulence mixing organic matter with water and air. An example might be sea foam that you may have seen on beaches. But in addition to the natural occurring foam, foam can also form from synthetic substances like Pfas. And often synthetic substances can intermix with natural foam, so you're likely to have both. So since mid-2020, Division of Water Resources have received some reports about surface water foam, and foam samples have been analyzed at our Division of Water Resources chemistry lab, and those results have routinely depicted presence of many Pfas compounds. So similar to the precautions you would take when you are encountering surface waters that exhibit indications of waste, and by that I mean sewer overflows or an algae bloom or maybe an oil sheen or something, you would not want to have exposure to those kinds of surface waters. So we also recommend that with foam and avoid contact with that, including pets and children as well. What the other thing about that is that matrix also contains bacteria and viruses, pathogens as well. So it's a good idea to not be in contact with that media. I do want to take a second and talk about the picture on the top right. That is a stream. It's an urban stream. There is a sewer line that's crossing the stream. It's encased in ductile iron. It's not leaking. That's common in some urban settings. What it's doing though is sitting on top of the water and it's mounting foam up behind it. And while it's not necessarily common or normal to see a utility crossing the stream like that, but you often see woody debris or limbs hanging into the water, and you can find foam where it's expressed. You can find it that way. So just as an indication of where to avoid it. So finally, again, the Division of Water Resources is working to enhance our capacities to work with this matrix. We've developed operating procedures with respect to dealing with foam investigations. We've created some database processes, fill forms, and develop those for use. As when we're working with a new media like this, we still have to do the internal education and internal education on proper sample techniques, and also expand our lab capacities. So thank you. That's my final slide for today, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Danny. Before we move on, I just want to note I'm seeing some questions come into the question and answer box in the WebEx format, so thank you for those. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to complete the presentations first, and then we'll move into a Q&A period. And we're going to start our Q&A with the folks who signed up to speak tonight. And after those folks have had a chance to ask their questions and have those answered, then at the end we'll move on to the questions in the Q&A, time permitting. So now let's move on to our final speaker, and that is the Director of the Division of Air Quality, Mike Abrzezinskis, who's going to speak to us today about air emissions. Mike.
Thank you, Julie, and good evening, everyone. Again, I'm Mike Abrzezinskis. I'm the Director for the Division of Air Quality. Appreciate the opportunity to be with y'all tonight. Next slide, please. So we're going to cover 4 main areas in the air quality discussion tonight. And focus on the performance testing related to the thermal oxidizer scrubber control system. We're going to talk a little bit about the facility-wide GenX emissions cap. We're also going to discuss a recent violation and civil penalty assessment regarding the air emissions. And then we'll also talk about our division's atmospheric deposition data that we're collecting near field to the Comores facility. Next slide, please. Okay, so you've heard a lot about the air emission controls and the role that air emissions have played in some of the other issues we've heard about this evening. So the consent order that was discussed earlier, one of the centerpieces of that with regard to air emissions was a requirement to install improved air emission controls, and specifically a thermal oxidizer scrubber system. That installation was required by December 31st of 2019 and designed to control all PFAS in all process streams routed to the control system at an efficiency of 99.99%. That thermal oxidizer scrubber system was installed and operational by the end of 2019, and the required stack testing demonstrating the required removal efficiency occurred in February 2020 and January of 2021. Our division reviewed the results of the required stack tests and confirmed the 99.99% control efficiency. Next slide, please. So another major component in the consent order required Chemours to reduce facility-wide GenX emissions by 99% relative to their baseline emissions level back in 2017, which was 2,302.7 pounds. This consent order requirement was eventually reflected in the air quality permit and shows up as a cap of 23.027 pounds of GenX. Now, in 2020, the reported GenX emissions from Chemours that we reviewed and confirmed came in at 15.3 pounds facility-wide, so under that 23.027 pound cap. Next slide, please. While the monthly 2020 GenX emissions levels led to compliance with that 23-pound limit for the first 14 months of that requirement, emissions of GenX were notably higher in March of 2021. And so this graph illustrates that. The green bars show the monthly facility-wide GenX emissions in pounds. Our investigation of this issue found the March 2021 GenX emission level was due to process issues upstream of one of the carbon absorber control devices at the facility. Due to those process issues, the carbon absorber control at the Vinyl Ethers North process unit did not perform as expected or required, resulting in higher emissions. Next slide, please. So the form of the limit in the air quality permit, which stems from the consent order, is a 12-month rolling sum of facility-wide GenX emissions. And so one way to look at that is every month you look back at the prior 12 months emissions and you compare that to the limit of 23.027 pounds as shown as the red line on this graph. The purple line on the graph illustrates that 12-month rolling sum of facility-wide GenX emissions. And once you include that data point from March of 2021 that I showed on the prior slide, the facility entered a state of non-compliance relative to that permit condition. While the monthly GenX emissions after March of 2021 returned to more typical levels due to actions Chemours took to get the performance of the carbon absorber back to normal, the 12-month rolling sum of GenX emissions will include that March 2021 data point for 11 more months. So when considering the emissions that took place in the months preceding and just after March of 2021, it's unlikely that the 12-month rolling sum of facility-wide GenX emissions will drop below the required 23.027 pound limit until March of 2022. Next slide, please. So in response to that information, we issued a notice of violation and recommendation of enforcement on August 26th of this year to Chemours. We followed that up with the issuance of a civil penalty assessment on October 1st, specifically for 7 violations for failure to reduce 12-month rolling sum facility-wide emissions of GenX compounds to less than that 23.027 pound cap. Those 7 violations cover the March through September time period. Keep in mind the civil penalty assessment went out on October 1st. Also included were 26 violations for failure to properly operate and maintain the control device. And the total assessment summed to just over $305,000. Now I want to note that non-compliance with the 12-month rolling sum facility-wide GenX emissions limit may persist into the future beyond the date of the civil penalty that was issued. So any period of non-compliance that occurs subsequent to this assessment will be addressed through a separate action as appropriate. I'd also like to note, while on this slide, if we can go back one slide, please, on just this past Friday, November 12th, Comores appealed this assessment by filing a petition for a contested case hearing with the Office of Administrative Hearings. And while I don't have any additional details on that at this point, I can say that DAQ will vigorously defend this assessment. Next slide, please. All right, and I'll wrap up this evening by sharing the atmospheric deposition data that the Division of Air Quality has been collecting near the Comores facility since early 2018. The data comes from monitoring equipment owned and operated by DAQ that are located between 1 and 2.1 miles from the center of the Comores facility. And let me say thank you to the handful of folks that host one of these sites on their property. Each colored line on the graph represents data from each of those monitoring sites. And so this data illustrates some of the pre-control period in the 2018 and 2019 window, and the post-control period in 2020 and 2021. I'll note that that thermal oxidizer scrubber control system was installed and became operational there at the beginning of 2020. Since then, we've seen a reduced level of total atmospheric deposition of GenX. However, an exception to that is the area that I've circled in February and March of 2021 on this graph. During that time period, we saw higher deposition of GenX relative to any period since the beginning of 2020. Those March 2021 readings coincide with the higher emission levels that led to the violations that we discussed earlier. The elevated February 2021 deposition readings coincide with some of the Outfall 002 data that the Division of Water Resources shared earlier in the presentation. So both of our divisions continue our analysis and investigation of those readings. Okay, well, next slide. That's the end of my presentation. My contact information is provided here, and really appreciate the opportunity to give the update this evening, and I'll hand it back to you, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So now it's time for us to move into the question and answer portion of our evening. First, let me just remind you, we're going to call the speakers from the sign-in sheets. We're asking each speaker to limit their question to 2 minutes so that everyone has time to answer questions. And then the panel will be here to answer questions for you. At the end of that time, if we have time available, we'll go to the questions in the chat. I also want to mention, I noticed there's a speaker who signed up for more than one time period. I'm going to call on you to speak, and then I'm going to let the others speak, and then we'll come back to you to make sure that everyone else also has time to speak and gets their 2 minutes. First, let me introduce an elected official who's with us tonight, Representative John Zoka of District 45 of Cumberland County. Representative Zoka, would you like to speak tonight? I know you had signed up maybe to speak this evening.
DEQ putting on this very informative briefing. I know that things are changing as we move along every day, and it's a good update. I'm looking forward to the questions from the residents of Cumberland County because I know they have a lot of questions. So just real briefly, thank you very much for having this meeting tonight.
Thank you, Representative Zoka. Appreciate your appearance tonight. Now we're going to move on to the speakers who have signed up to speak. As I mentioned, we're going to call your name and we'll unmute your mic. to give you time to speak. We'll also give you information about when you're getting close to the end of your time to speak. So our first speaker tonight is Emily Donovan.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Emily, go ahead.
Okay, great, thank you. Really appreciate the presentations and all the effort and work that clearly has been going on. I put a good bit of my questions into the chat because it was unclear to me if there was going to be time to get all of them answered and if there was real time. But basically the biggest concerns that I have is I'm drinking water that comes from a tap. I don't get to choose whether it's surface water or groundwater, but the levels in my tap water far exceeds 70 parts per trillion and 10 parts per trillion that's afforded to groundwater users in the consent agreement. And I'm just wondering what DEQ is going to do to ensure that surface water users, because there's 350,000 of us who have been continually exposed for the last 4 years to these levels, and they're coming from Comores. We've got them documented. What is being done? What can DEQ do? And will to provide us with immediate relief. We cannot keep waiting for the utilities to upgrade their systems. That is an important piece of the puzzle, but we need these exposures to stop now. Do I keep going with all my other questions, or do we do a back and forth? I just have 2 minutes, so I really want to honor that time. I also had a question about the composite samples. Are they going to be posted on the website so that we can track them easily and clearly? Outfall 002, why are the levels of GenX present at all? That was unclear to me. Is that stormwater runoff? What's happening that we even have spikes? Is Comores allowed to release small amounts of GenX into outfall 002? And I believe, is that at what, 140 parts per trillion or lower? I couldn't remember what the consent agreement had said. And then surface water foam. I noticed that DEQ recommends avoiding contact with this foam, but we have PFAS and foam all over Brunswick County beaches. I just worked with NC State to get foam samples done. We have massive foam events that happen. These are not just normally occurring foam events on these beaches, and residents are really concerned. And so if we're being told, if DEQ is saying not to touch that foam, then is there going to be signs put up? Are residents going to be notified? Are we not allowed to go on our beaches anymore? And what is being done to kind of understand that? And then what's the process to
letting you know
get?
the 2 minutes are up.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Want to finish that last sentence, Emily?
Yes.
She might have gone on. Thank you so much for your questions, Emily. There are quite a few there. Let's see if we can get several of those answered here. I'm going to go back. I know you've entered some of these in the chat, so I'm going to go back to some of those early ones. The first one about the composite samples, and maybe Danny can answer this. Are the results of the composite samples posted on the website?
Yes, the current data set that we have is on the website. I was talking with our PIO this past week or the week before, and so that data should be updated. We are working internally to figure out ways to expedite or improve the speed at which we get that data uploaded but yes, it's what we have right now is there.
Can you also speak to those spikes at the outfall of GenX? She's asking why there are spikes in the outfall at all and where they might be coming from.
Yes, I can. So it certainly varies. The site has a lot of PFAS contamination on it, and it responds to different storm events and rain events as well. So that's largely where the PFAS is coming from. At least that's what we understand. There may be some other activities on site from just, I guess, normal facility work that results in changes just due to the contamination of the site. So anyway, that's but as far as their processed water that they had been discharging in the past, they are removing that from the facility.
And she had a couple of questions about foam. asking what's the plan to address foam found on the beaches, and asking if there's a process to get foam tested.
Yes, so we don't have a formal process to go sample foam. We just don't have the lab capacities to do that. We are doing some sampling. I am very interested in her observations on what's been occurring on the beaches and the sampling that she's been associated with. So I'd like to learn more about that. But and I do know our Wilmington Regional Office has had some complaints on it or some investigations associated with it. But right now, that's all the information I have on foam. I know we don't, on the foam beach issue, I know we don't have very much data on that issue, at least the Division of Water Resources.
Thank you, Danny. I hope we haven't missed any of your questions, Emily, but if we've missed something, you put it in the bottom of the chat and we have time, we'll get back to that at the end, or you can follow up by email. And that's the same true for anyone if we're not able to answer all your questions. But let's go on to the next person who'd like to ask a question. Next, I have David Anderson.
Julie, I don't see a David Anderson. There are a couple Andersons on there, or they may be on the phone. If they could raise their hand, if they're on the phone, it's *3. Or if they're under another name, if they could raise their hand, I would unmute them at that time.
Okay, we'll come back to that person if you raise your hand. Up next, we have Mike Waters.
Secretary Beiser for the work she's done. I've got basically two questions because you guys kind of answered some of the ones I had before. One of the things, has PFAS ever been used on the Fayetteville Works facility? And then the second question is, well, three questions. Second question is, why can't DEQ tell us what the PQL is for those chemicals listed on attachment C of the consent order? I've had a public records request in for 2 years now, and it still hasn't been answered. And then the last question is, with the violations that ChemWars has consistently done and been noticed of violations and penalties on them, will DEQ enforce State Statute 143-215-2 alpha at the groundwater quality standards, which is PQL? Real easy. That's the only question.
Thank you, Mr. Waters. I think I will direct those to Michael Scott.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you for the question, Mr. Waters. The first one, I'm going to make sure I understand, but has PFAS ever been used at the site? You know, we have data going back to some early detections of PFOA at the property. Obviously, you know, a multitude of different detections of PFAS from the groundwater data, air emissions data. You know, if we need to clarify that response or I didn't hear your question right, I'd be glad to. But a lot of documented data on that front. You know, you and I have talked about the North Carolina requirements for groundwater, which are called the 2L requirements in North Carolina, where if a non-naturally occurring man-made material, if you will, is detected, like these compounds, PFAS, those groundwater requirements default to a detection limit, or PQL, practical quantitative limit. When the consent order was negotiated, you know, obviously that response to comments and public input, you know, the 10 nanogram per liter or 10 part per trillion level was something that was in those response to comments. You know, we have seen labs, I think you've experienced this, Mr. Waters, that do detect now less than that level, some even down to the single digit level. So as you know, a lot of things continue to evolve, including the science, the federal updates on PFAS. We're seeing more and more discussion of the detections and levels for these compounds go from double-digit levels to single digits. So we continue to reference the PQL as 10 nanograms per liter. We do know that labs can detect lower than that. You know, and we'll be glad to further that discussion. I know your statutory reference on 143-215. You know, the provisions that statute provides, the replacement of drinking water, cutting off the emissions to the environment, were all reached through that negotiated order that was entered into in Bladen County Superior Court as the consent order. So that was the mechanism that was pursued, by the state to address this contamination, to cut off the discharge and ensure that people have a safe drinking water supply. And like I said, I'd be glad to double back to your first question if we didn't fully answer it. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Harper Peterson.
Julie, I do not see a Harper Peterson on the attendees list unless they can raise their hand. Again, if they're on the phone, we'll unmute them their way. *3 again on the phone is how you raise your hands, but I'm not seeing that name at this time.
Okay. Our next speaker then is Margaret Richmond.
Again, I'm not seeing that name on the attendees list.
I think the email starts with OBX, if it's an email. The next speaker who signed up is Ray Person.
Again, not on the list that I'm seeing here.
Okay, let's move on to Carl Vandermeyden.
All right, you should be unmuted.
Okay. Great presentations. Really enjoyed the information. My name is Carl Vandermeyden. I'm a Deputy Executive Director at the Cape Fear Public Utility Authority. I have a brief statement and then a question at the end. But first off, just want to thank the NCDEQ and its staff for their work to protect the sources of our community's drinking water and hold those who threaten those sources of water accountable. Specifically want to mention the department's November 3rd announcement that it's holding Commerce responsible for Pfas contamination in New Hanover County's groundwater and directing the company to prepare an action plan to provide relief to those affected by its actions. Even as we welcome this latest development, CFUA remains very focused on Pfas from Commerce that continues to taint the Cape Fear River, which is our community's primary source for drinking water. We recognize that the state has mandated important measures. For example, you suspended Commerce's permit to discharge processed wastewater, and you ordered the reduction of mass loading from the highly contaminated groundwater Fayetteville Works site. But while various interim remediation measures have been implemented by Commerce in an attempt to reduce PFAS loadings to the Cape Fear River, we still consistently detect Commerce's PFAS at our Kings Bluff raw water intake. This includes levels of difficult to treat PFMOAA that appears to be on the increase, especially after these remediation measures were recently installed by Commerce at their site. So we urge DEQ to investigate why PFAS reductions outlined in the consent order addendum are not yet being realized by downstream utilities. The specific question is, why are specific compounds like PFMOA increasing for downstream utilities despite the implementation of remediation efforts at their site? Thank you for the opportunity to submit these comments this evening.
Thank you for your comment. I think I'll pass that on to Danny in Water Resources. Danny, if you could hear him, he was asking about why are they still checking PFAS in the surface water, particularly PFMOAA, which is increasing?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, so we have been looking at some of the trend data at the Cape Fear Public Utilities intake, and during the past, I guess, growing season, there has been what seems to be a increased trend in total PFAS, specifically PFMOAA. There is kind of anticipation that it would fluctuate with changes in flow or low flow conditions. But as far as why it's specifically increasing, we're very interested in working on that issue. I don't have an answer for it right now. We've been talking about it here internally. So we're going to continue to try to investigate that and get a answer and get a better understanding of what's going on. But that's the answer I have right now. But thank you for the question, and we will continue to follow up and investigate that issue and try to better understand what's being expressed in the Lower Cape Fear.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Our next speaker is Jean Allen.
I see a Jean Ann, but I'm not sure if that's the same person. If it is the same person, if you could raise your hand either on the computer by clicking on your name and raising hand, or if you're on the phone, please raise your hand. But right now I'm not seeing that name in the list.
Okay. Our next speaker then is Stuart Schwartz.
Stuart was here earlier, but I'm not seeing him on the list at this point here. Hold on 1 second. Let me double check. No, I'm not seeing him at this time.
Okay, thanks, Ethan. We'll move on then to LaDerek Green.
No, that name is not on the list either.
Okay. Next speaker, Lydia Waters.
No, there's not a Lydia Waters on the list at this time.
Okay. Larry Sneeden.
Nope. Not on the list at this time.
Furman Matthews.
Not on the list at this time.
Okay. I think that brings us back to Mr. Waters. Mike?
For Mr. Scott, that wasn't PFAS, that was PFOS, PFOS, whether it was used on the plant. It's very unique. As you know, the blood work came back for the 153 tested, and it's very unique because I also had 2 of my Huskies tested, 9 chemicals in me and 7 in my Husky. So, you know, it's more of a statement that, you know, it's amazing when you look at the pilot test from the GAC system, which I'll tell you, GAC systems work. But it's very concerning when I see the PFAS level in my blood and PFOA, you know, through the roof. And it kind of, you know, makes me wonder, is that why I have leukemia now? You know, so, and that's why I was very curious on the PQLs and want those on those chemicals on attachment C. It's more than just a curious interest. We're trying to do that with the county on tax evaluations, and the only way they'll do anything is a letter from DEQ specifying what the PQL is for those chemicals. So, you know, if I got to go to court too to get it, I will. I mean, I've got a public records request in, can't get it. I guess next step will be court.
Thank you, Mr. Waters.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Waters. I see you were referring to the PFOS compound, what I would say on that front is we have, talked with Comores about that particular compound, PFOS. I was speaking to PFOA earlier. Both of those, as you know, we consider as some of the legacy or older compounds when it comes to these PFAS. I did show the slide, I think it was slide 5 this evening, with the on-site groundwater data where there are detections of PFOS. They're not in the range of GenX and some of the other compounds, but I'll use that as a starting point as you ask about some of these older compounds and the presence of them. There is groundwater data that shows detections. They're not high detections, but of PFOS. And appreciate the sharing of information that you always do with our team. And the good dialogue we have with you. And I know your concerns as it relates to the detectable levels of these compounds. For others, the consent order references 10 nanograms per liter, for the detection of the attachment C compounds. Appreciate your comments, Mr. Waters, and concerns related to lower levels. And as I mentioned, there are labs that now detect down into the single digit ranges, which we did not have just a few years ago. But thank you again for your comments.
So that is the end of the folks who have signed up to speak tonight and ask questions. I see we're at 7:37, so we do have a little bit of time left. So I'm going to go through some of the questions that were entered in the Q&A here, and we'll pose those questions to the panel. So the first question I see here is asking about dermal exposure. If only small amounts of PFAS can get into the skin, what's considered a small amount? I'm going to send that to Zach, if you want to answer that. The rest of the question is, we know tiny amounts in drinking water can cause harm. For overexposed communities, what does this mean? We need more detailed information because this acknowledgement of dermal exposures is really critical to residents overexposed via drinking water.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And so for GenX specifically, and I think the question is more broad, but for GenX specifically, there's information in the EPA's new toxicity assessment, and I'm not sure if you've seen that yet, but happy to share that link or make sure there's information about the permeability coefficient, the amount of the chemical that gets in through the skin that gets into some of the details and the numbers, but basically that it's there's less absorbed than for chemicals that are generally considered easily absorbed through skin. But appreciate that you're looking for more detail, and for GenX, that's available in the toxicity assessment. It's also available, I believe, in some other PFAS from more detailed information that's out on the EPA website. And I'll also note that they're re-looking at their PFOA and Pfas toxicity data, and I think that was mentioned earlier. So there may be more granular, more specific information about dermal absorption for different PFAS, but overall, the absorption is low. But as I mentioned before, there are animal studies that show skin irritation can occur at certain levels. So happy to figure out a way to share those links or provide that information through the contact information that was given in the slides.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Next question. So the next question is asking about the new toxicity assessment, which is potentially lowering the GenX advisory level. And this person's saying to approximately 4 parts per trillion. Is the action level going to drop for Comores from 140 and 10 to this new level?
Julie, I can take that. This is Sushma.
Thank you.
Sure. The paragraph 19 in the consent order includes language. Specifically, it says that detections of GenX compounds in excess or exceedance of 140 parts per trillion or any applicable health advisory, whichever is lower. So EPA's health advisory anticipated for drinking water in spring of 2022 will enable us to continue to enforce the consent order at a lower advisory. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. So I think some of these have already been answered. One question, has staff been added to the DEQ? This is a interesting day to ask that question with the new budget out. But I didn't know if anyone wanted to give an overview.
Secretary Beiser, I'll give it a shot, and maybe if you want to follow up, please feel free. So I started in my current role officially in May of this year, and I would say that right now DEQ has been operating with with the same staffing level as we have for the last several years. Our permitting and other compliance staff have been redirected to respond to this unprecedented several years of emerging contaminants matter. We do anticipate some positions to be added when the budget is approved based on the latest information. There are a few that will help and continue on this work, but there is a lot more work than we have the staff for. So I don't think we have added other than redirect our existing staff to this important priority.
And Sushma, I'll just add on to that in the budget that's going through the General Assembly as we speak, there are 5 additional positions for PFAS, not as many as perhaps we had hoped, but it is going to provide some additional resources along with making 2 other positions that had been temporary to be added to deal with PFAS permanent, which is good news as well. So as Sushma said, we had not had additional staff so far, but are anticipating with the passage of the budget that will give us some additional new resources.
Thank you. The next question I think is for Danny. What are the protections for rain events above 1 inch in 24 hours? And does the information that was presented today mean that heavy rain events will wash more PFAS into the river?
Yes, thank you for the question. Treating a 1 inch 24-hour storm event as a approach or a way to ensure that you are treating the storm event flow that is carrying like the most concentrated pollutant load that may be deposited or onto the ground. So that's often a treatment goal to get that first flush event and get that treated, because that's going to be the most contaminated volume of water that you'll receive. So certainly the balance of that water, if it storms greater than that 1 inch 24-hour event, will flow from the site. And it for a facility like this, it will have PFAS in it. But the idea is to target that most contaminated flush of the storm event, and that's the intent of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. So I have I think that's a comment. I don't really see a question. How about GenX is only one of the compounds. Are you going to expand in any of the others that are making us sick? And asking about having wells retested. As you're aware, the Fayetteville Works plant sits on top of a toxic lake. Our PFAS blood levels exceed the nation's. I think there's 2 parts here. One has to do with what PFAS are being addressed, and then the other has to do with retesting.
Yeah, Julie, this is Michael. I can start with a response. Is a great question. You know, this discussion is so much broader than one compound, meaning GenX. You hear a lot around the country about PFOA and PFOS. Per the consent order that DEQ entered into with Comores and Cape Fear River Watch, there's a total of 12 compounds that are being closely tracked. There's actually 2 isomer pairs that make a total of 14. But the conversation is broader than just the GenX compound. We're working actively not only for levels that are spelled out in the consent order, but with our rulemaking body, the Environmental Management Commission, actually this week, meaning Thursday, to further the PFAS standards discussion, and also with our Secretary of Science Advisory Board, an advising body to DEQ on next steps with PFAS for our state, and ultimately what compounds we may be considering for further standards development. So a lot of information is coming out, like we've covered tonight, at the federal level. I know there was recent, a public meeting on the blood serum data and detections of some of these other compounds, not GenX, but other PFAS in citizens' blood. And so a lot of active work that's very broad, meaning not just 1 or 2 compounds, but multiple compounds, and determining their impacts, not only on human health, but also the environment. So I hope that's at least a starting point to the answer to the question, and appreciate it being asked.
Michael and Julie, this is Sushma. I'll add to that a little bit. At the last 2 SAB meetings, DEQ provided overview of our list of PFAS-related compounds that are prevalent and detected in various media. And as a result of that, staff have provided a priority list of those compounds that we are focusing on. And some of those compounds, as Michael mentioned, PFOA, PFAS, PFBA, EPA has already conducted either toxicity assessment or are in the process of releasing drinking water health advisories. And so all of this information is allowing us at the state level to exercise our authority and evaluate what our options are. So in the coming months and tomorrow and this week at the EMC, we do plan on talking about what some of those next steps are. But coming up in the December SAB meeting, we will deliberate over a few questions we've asked them and plan on our next activities related to standards, as well as looking at sources of contaminants. Thank you.
Thank you, Sushma. And I know also for those who have who are in the Comores area and have received water treatment systems, we are testing those for more than just GenX. And they are showing to be effective at removing all the PFAS compounds we can test for from drinking water. So the same remedy works for all the PFAS that we're able to test for at this time. The next question. Comores is just one company using PFAS. How are we monitoring other violators? Are there other violation citations you can reference? So this might be another one for multiple people on the panel that might want to respond.
Yeah, Julie, I can start. Great question. This subject for our state and a lot of states around the country is broader than just one entity or one company. The division that Julie and I work in, the Division of Waste Management, we're looking closely at specific production facilities, those that produce firefighting foam that's often used in emergency management responses. That can be a source of these compounds. There's a lot of active work with Department of Defense installations around North Carolina, from the Army, Marine Corps, different aspects of the National Guard to assess PFAS that may have come from firefighting activities at those installations, and also other facilities like metal platers, specific production facilities that we do know, and at the federal level is well known that PFAS may exist. So we're looking closely at those facilities and more specifically at groundwater data associated with those sites to make sure if these compounds are detected, that we're quickly looking at surrounding areas, communities, to make sure there's no off-site impacts. And I know that Mike and Danny have some ambient information too that may be helpful in the response also. Thanks.
Hey, thank you, Michael. Yeah, the Division of Water Resources have been conducting some sampling at Falls Lake and at Jordan Lake. And this past summer has been sampling some water intakes at the Broad River and some other river basins through the state as an effort to kind of enhance our surveillance efforts. We've also done some surveillance on some POTWs, or publicly owned treatment works, looking at what their characterizations of their effluent waste streams look like in some industries. We are wanting to expand that effort, and to the point of having an enhanced, sustained monitoring program is important to us, and that's something that we want to pursue. But thank you. That's a great question.
And I can just add briefly from the Division of Air Quality, kind of zooming out and looking beyond the specifics of any single facility's impacts, we've started a background PFAS deposition monitoring network in North Carolina in order to quantify the role of atmospheric deposition in any findings of these emerging compounds in our state's surface water or groundwater. I'm very pleased to say that thus far, we have not seen a lot of detections from that background atmospheric deposition monitoring network. Very few hits in our samples that go back 2.5, 3 years now. And when we do see anything in the samples, it's usually a very low amount of PFAS and often some of the legacy PFAS compounds. So that information is posted on our website, so I encourage you to explore that if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, Danny, and Mike. Gonna move on. See some comments. The next question has to do with data from, looks like it, data in the CFPUA press release on New Hanover County monitoring wells that shows some of PFAS tested. And this person is interested in getting a breakdown of the concentration of PFAS. I don't think that's DEQ data. Is that correct?
We do have some of that data.
You do, okay. Can that be shared?
Most of it, I think, or much of it is online already.
Okay.
So it's, let's see. So it ranges, most of the, I don't have it in front of me, but most of the data is, I guess majority is 70 parts or 70 nanograms per liter to down to 10, and much of it is from 10 to non-detect. That's probably the bulk of it. And then there's some sample results that are greater than that, and then some that's over 140. So there's a range. I just don't have the data in front of me.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the person who posted that question maybe to send an email request to that email address we mentioned earlier, which is the comments.comores@ncdner.gov, and we will get you that information. Another question about eating tomatoes with PFAS. Wondering about PFAS in vegetables grown in the area. Dr. Moore, I don't know if you had any information about consuming vegetables grown in the area. I know this question has come up before.
Yeah, it has, and there definitely can be exposure through produce that's grown in soil or with water that's contaminated with PFAS. So that's been well documented. The levels that are in the produce, there's a huge amount of variation. So there's a lot of work being done now to help understand what people can do to limit the amount of PFAS that gets taken up into produce or into fruits and vegetables that are grown. Overall, there's of course lots of benefits of growing your own fruits and vegetables, and but certainly have to be weighed against the concerns about the possibility of exposure to PFAS in that way. So I can't give a very specific answer because it really does vary a lot when there have been studies done of PFAS levels, PFAS concentrations. It's just a huge range, even in areas that are close together in terms of which types of fruits or vegetables tend to have more PFAS. But there is work being done on that topic, including here in North Carolina from researchers with the PFAS network here that was funded with money from our General Assembly that's looked into this. So that's also information that we could provide to folks afterwards through the contact information if they want more specifics.
Thank you. I know we have a question about Brunswick County. They have reverse osmosis water treatment at the plant, asking if that will resolve the problem. And if not, what should citizens do who own riverfront or oceanfront homes? Asking are PFAS in the water systems countywide in Brunswick County?
That's a good question. So just from the intake water, there is PFAS compounds there, and there is PFAS compounds in the finished water. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there's going to be some amount. I think that right now that's the best answer I have. I just don't have the data, the specific data that the person's asking available.
Okay, thank you. And I know that brings us right to 8 o'clock. If you do have additional questions we didn't have time to answer, you're welcome to submit those again to that email address, the comments.comores@ncdenr.gov. I want to thank everyone for your time tonight. Just as a reminder, we will be posting all the presentations from tonight on the DEQ website, probably towards the end of the week. So you'll be able to go and find them there on the GenX Information for Residents page under presentations. So go there to look. And if you have other questions, again, you can send them to us. There's also information for each of the speakers at the end of their presentation if you'd like to send a question directly to them. Thank you again for your time tonight. Hope you have a good evening.